In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to part 5 of our coverage of the 1980 unsolved murders of Rose Burkert and Roger Atkison. If you have not listened to the other 4 parts, go back and give those episodes a listen, save them for later, or don't, you do you. In part 1, we went over Rose and Roger's crime scene in detail. In part 2, we learned more about Rose and Roger, their last movements, and the initial investigation. In part 3, I went over some of the names that come up repeatedly in their investigation, and last week, in part 4, we talked about the 1980 unsolved murder of William Kyle, who died in a similar fashion to Rose and Roger, and we went over the similarities and differences between those two crime scenes. Now, today, we are going to cover another murder, and the reason we are covering this is because in the 2019 episode of the DNA of Murder with Paul Holes, while Paul is reviewing the case for William Kyle, the case we're going to talk about today comes up, and it's also mentioned in some reporting from 1992. And once again, there are similarities between the case we're going to cover today, William Kyle's case, and Rose and Roger's case. Now, there's not a lot of information about this specific case, so I'm going to cover what I have been able to find, and once again, we will go over the similarities and differences. Next week, then, we will talk about Raimundo Esparza. He was a suspect in William Kyle's case, and he's been brought up as a potential suspect in Rose and Roger's. We'll talk about all 3 of these cases, talk about the reasons to believe the perpetrator of Rose and Roger's murder was someone who knew them. We'll talk about the reasons to believe it was a stranger and reasons to believe it was a possible serial killer. And lastly, I'll go over what I have received back from my various records requests. It hasn't been a lot, but we'll go over what I've received so far. But let's get into the case today. Like I said before, there's not a lot of information out there, but we're going to go over what we know. On the afternoon of Tuesday, October 27th, 1970, a body was found by a housekeeper in a room at a travel inn in Meridian, Mississippi. The victim was a male, and he was found in a kneeling position by the bed. His knees were on the ground, and his torso was lying over the bed. An article published in the Clarion Ledger on October 30th, 1970, says he had been brutally beaten or chopped to death with a heavy, sharp instrument, believed to be either a hatchet or an axe. Now, I have only found one photo of this particular crime scene, and it's from the 2019 episode of the DNA of Murder with Paul Holes, but you can see the victim lying over the bed, his knees on the floor. Now, his legs are crossed at the ankles with his left foot crossed over his right. In the photo, the area where his head is blurred, but you can see he's not wearing a shirt, and the bed sheet is covering his waist down to where his knees would be. Another article also says he was completely nude. But the part of the blanket that's covering his lower back and waist is covered in blood. But there isn't blood on his bare back, which makes me think that perhaps the blanket was moved and he was covered with it afterward. The only information I've been able to find on his injuries is that he was brutally beaten or, quote, chopped to death with a heavy, sharp instrument. Now, the article uses the word chopped, but I have not seen anything to suggest that he was dismembered in any way, and the photo where you can see his body doesn't show that either. An article published on December 14th, 1970 says he was only wounded on the head, which to me shows that the blanket covering his waist, which is covered in blood, had to have been moved after he was killed. The coroner in this case, Vance Stevens, said the murder was a, quote, savage slaying. He said the man suffered several deep gashes in his head and that any one of the several deep cuts could have ultimately caused his death. But otherwise, in the photo, you can see that there's blood all over the headboard of the bed and the wall behind it. An article published in the Delta Democrat Times on October 28, 1970, says that a towel had been shoved into the victim's mouth. Police at the time said the victim's billfold was missing, but refused to speculate on whether or not robbery might have been a motive. One last element of the crime scene comes from a comment made during the episode of the DNA of Murder with Paul Holes, and this detail is that there was apparently toothpaste squirted into the toilet at this scene. Other than that, those are really the only bits of information I have on the crime scene itself for this case, aside from the fact that no murder weapon was ever found at the scene. The victim in this case was identified after several hours using automobile registration papers and the name and address given when he registered at the motel. Authorities identified the victim as 23-year-old Jack Wayne McDonald from Birmingham, Alabama, and he was a salesman who sold foreign car parts. Jack was married and had 2 children, and at the time of his murder, one of his children was 2 years old and the other was just 3 months. Now, investigators believe this was Jack's first trip to Meridian, Mississippi. In the Clarion Ledger article, a detective was quoted as saying, "Mr. McDonald only recently transferred from Fort Lauderdale, Florida to Birmingham." And this was confirmed by a man named Roy, who was a parts manager for the company Jack worked for. Roy said Jack had been transferred to Birmingham about 3 weeks prior to his murder from the company's Florida office. Roy said Jack was a salesman for the company's Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi districts. Now, let's try to piece together what we know about Jack's last movements. Police say Jack had gone to Tuscaloosa, Alabama on Monday and was later seen in York, Alabama, but was en route to Meridian. Jack then trekked into the Travel Inn motel in Meridian around 8 p.m. on Monday, October 26, 1970. He was a traveling salesman. The articles say he was there for his job, but there isn't any information I have been able to find on if Meridian was his final destination or if there were other places he planned to go on this trip. But while in Meridian on the evening of October 26th, people did report seeing Jack before his death, and they reported that they saw him with another man. The Clarion Ledger says Jack and a man met at a bar, had a few drinks together, and then went to a popular restaurant in Meridian around 10:30 p.m. Now, I don't know the name of the bar or the restaurant, but there were witnesses who saw this man Jack was with, and a composite sketch was made of him, which I will post this week to my social media. The man was described as being around 30 years old, 6 feet tall, and weighing around 170 pounds. Witnesses said the man had sandy-colored hair that was either wavy or curly and light-colored eyes. He was apparently wearing a brown suit when seen with Jack, and people who heard the man speak said he had an Irish or Scottish accent. An article published on October 30th, 1970 in the Birmingham News had the headline, quote, "Police hunt natty dresser," which I did not know what natty meant. According to the internet, that means someone who is particularly stylish and neat. Now, detectives put word out to the public asking for any information on who this man might be and if anyone knew him, and that they didn't consider this guy to be a suspect, but if he was the last person who saw Jack alive, then obviously they wanted to speak with him. There were also reports right around the time of Jack's murder saying that police were looking for a, quote, heavy-set young man with blonde hair. Now, I don't know if this is the same person police are describing. This one says Jack was seen riding with this mystery man in a, quote, out-of-town car around 10 p.m. My assumption is that this heavy-set young man with blonde hair is the same person witnesses saw at the restaurant. There is just, I suppose, a discrepancy in describing his body type. The man Jack was seen with at the restaurant and bar was described as being 6 feet tall and 170 pounds, which is definitely not what I would consider to be heavy set. Detectives again believe that Jack had never been to Meridian before and was a complete stranger to the area, so I have to wonder if this man was a client of his. It's unclear. Now, remember, Jack McDonald's murder is happening in October of 1970, so this is 10 years before the murder of William Kyle, before the murder of Rose Burkert, and before the murder of Roger Atkison. We know at some point because of the episode of the DNA of Murder with Paul Holes, that investigators looked into a possible link between Kyle's murder and Jack's. Because within Kyle's case file were details on Jack's murder. So in 1970, before Kyle, Rose, and Roger, what were investigators looking into? Well, outside of the quote natty dresser mystery man seen with Jack the night he was killed, authorities began looking into the possibility that a murder that happened just months after Jack's could potentially be linked. So let's quickly go through this one. This is a rabbit hole that actually has a resolution, and it's kind of a crazy story. On December 2nd, 1970, the body of 28-year-old Mark McConnell was found in a room at the Oceanside Holiday Inn in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He had been beaten over the head to death with the ceramic lid to the toilet tank. Now, police were quick to identify a suspect in this case, as Mark had a man check in with him at the hotel. And by the time the maid found him, this man and their rental car were nowhere to be found. Luckily for the hotel too, though, they had the man's name, James Frankenberry. Now, Frankenberry and McConnell had apparently met in Washington, D.C. and traveled along the East Coast, ending up in Fort Lauderdale. McConnell, the victim, was a traveling salesman as well, but he's described in reporting at the time as being a, quote, traveling smut peddler, because he sold pornographic films and literature geared towards, quote, homosexual men. Now, I don't have a lot of information on what evidence was collected at the scene, but it was enough for a grand jury to indict Frankenberry on first-degree murder. But they still had not found him, so a warrant was issued for his arrest on December 8th, and his photo was sent to police stations and newspapers in multiple states. Eventually, the rental car Frankenberry had fled the scene with was found abandoned in Mobile, Alabama, just days after the murder. And in late February of 1971, Frankenberry was arrested in St. Louis on bank robbery charges. So our boy Frankenberry was busy. Now, he is eventually extradited back to Florida, where he pleads guilty to the first-degree murder of Mark McConnell, and he is sentenced to life in prison. Now, news articles surrounding this case were really hitting the porn salesman part of this story. But wow, one article I saw, published in the San Francisco Examiner on February 8th, 1971, has the headline, quote, "Underworld link to porno films," and it's wild. The opening line says, quote, "San Francisco's multi-million-dollar dirty movie racket, like most other semi-legitimate quick-buck business casts, a large underworld shadow." The article highlights examples of people connected to the porn business who have been murdered, and Frankenberry and McConnell are used as an example. Their section reads, quote, "A porno movie salesman and enforcer, Mark McConnell, was beaten to death in a Fort Lauderdale motel. Left behind by the murderer or murderers was a card with the word mafioso written on it. Florida police, ascribing the killing to rivalry among porn dealers, are looking for a San Francisco dirty movie soldier named James Robert Frankenberry Jr., according to Homicide Inspector Steve Maxitopoulos. McConnell, the victim, was an employee of San Francisco's Seven Star Productions, which was a production company for, quote, dirty movies. He was also said to be peddling his product outside of his territory. So this was quite the rabbit hole I went down. I mean, a guy named Frankenberry, described as a dirty movie soldier, murdering a man for selling porn outside of his, quote, territory, is wild. And it sounds like it should be the plot of, like, a Netflix series or something. But let's get back to Jack McDonald's case. Now, investigators in Mississippi were apparently very enthusiastic about there being a link between the McConnell and McDonald murders, but Florida investigators didn't seem to be too keen on the idea. One article suggests that Mississippi authorities were very sure of this link because there really wasn't anything else to go on. But realistically, I do not think there's a connection between the murders of Jack McDonald or Mark McConnell. For one, if the article in the San Francisco Examiner is to be believed, McConnell's murder was relating to this mafia-like porn business, and I have not seen anything to suggest Jack McDonald was involved in anything like that. Additionally, the murder weapon was different, and Frankenberry I do not think is the natty dresser with a Scottish accent that was last seen with McDonald. So this story was really just a blip in the reporting, but I wanted to share it because it was such a crazy side story. But let's recenter here. The information on the Jack McDonald case was in the William Kyle file. So when William Kyle was murdered in 1980, at some point investigators made this connection that a murder 10 years prior in Mississippi had similar elements. Let's talk about what those similarities are. First, the crime scenes are very similar, and specifically the positioning of the body. If you do a side-by-side of the photos of Jack McDonald's body and William Kyle's body, they are almost identical. Both of them are kneeling on the floor with their torsos lying over the bed. And I will have those photos, they are blurred in certain areas, on my Patreon if you want to see them. Another similarity is the toothpaste at the scene. Toothpaste was reportedly in the toilet at Jack's scene, and if you remember, there was toothpaste on the ground next to William Kyle's foot. The same can be said for Rose and Roger's scene, where toothpaste was found in the tub. Now, in the William Kyle case, his wallet was described as being rifled through, and Jack McDonald's was also apparently stolen, though in both cases it's not clear if robbery was a motive. Roger Atkison's wallet was also rifled through. Now, all four victims, Rose Burkert, Roger Atkison, William Kyle, and Jack McDonald, were struck repeatedly in the back of the head with an axe-like instrument, and the murder weapon wasn't found for any of these murders. And in all three of these cases, the victims were found in motel rooms where the motel was right off of the interstate. Now, some of the main differences in these cases include Jack McDonald being found nude. None of the other victims were found nude. William Kyle was wearing shorts, you can tell from the photo, and reports say Roger Atkison was wearing his underwear. Additionally, in Jack McDonald's case, it is reported that there was a towel shoved into his mouth. I have not seen anything to suggest that there were similar elements in the other cases. Now, obviously with Jack McDonald and William Kyle, they were by themselves, and that wasn't the case with Roger, as he was with Rose. Now, in the episode, The DNA of Murder with Paul Holes, he closes the episode out being very convinced that the same man committed all four of these murders. And I mean, it's a strange coincidence. Similar murder weapons, similar wounds, and especially the toothpaste at each scene. In 2020, so soon after this Paul Holes episode aired, the FBI put out a notice called a VICAP alert, and I think I've mentioned this before. But they were seeking information from both other law enforcement agencies and the public. The alert says, quote, "If you have information relevant to this investigation or know of other cases that resemble the details of this homicide, victims killed in a motel near a busy interstate, weapon used was an axe, hatchet, or machete, toothpaste or soap found in an unusual location at the crime scene, writing or drawings left at the crime scene, please contact the agency below." So there was obviously a big effort out there to determine if in fact all three of these murders were related, if they were committed by the same person, and if there were other cases out there with similar elements. But yet, all three of these cases remain unsolved. I haven't seen any other cases with similar features, especially the toothpaste, or, the aspect of the soap in Rose and Roger's case. I haven't seen anything like that. So if you know of a similar one, please let me know so we can cover it. But that's all I have for Jack McDonald's murder, and that's all the time I have for today. Now remember, next week we are going to close out this series, and we're going to talk about Raimundo Esparza. We're going to discuss the case for the murders of Rose and Roger being the work of a serial killer, or it being someone who knew them. And we will go over what I have received so far from my records requests. Stay tuned for that, and as always, let me know what you think on social media or via email. We will see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself. If you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, there's no better place to begin than with Buzzsprout. It's the platform I use, and it makes publishing, promoting, and tracking your episodes so easy, even if you're not tech savvy. Plus, they help you get listed in all the major directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. And here's the best part. When you sign up for a paid Buzzsprout plan using my affiliate link, you'll get $20 off, and you'll be supporting the show at the same time. Just head to the description of this episode to find the affiliate link. Now, let's get back to the episode.